April 1943, Eastern Front, somewhere near the vast frozen plains of the Soviet Union. German panzer officers gathered around intelligence briefings with obvious smirks. The tales filtering in from frontline units were almost laughable. A new Soviet tank, unwieldy and slow, dubbed by their crews as the Russian pig. Its thick armor made it heavy and clumsy. The Nazis, masters of fast armored warfare, dismissed it as little more than a cumbersome beast easily outflanked and destroyed. They called it the T-34, a relic of desperate Soviet manufacturing, unworthy of respect from the panzer elite. But as the days passed and the warm winds of spring began to thaw frozen mud and snow, the reality on the battlefield was shifting dramatically. What was mocked as an oversized, slow brute suddenly transformed into an armored juggernaut that crushed the vaunted German lines with shocking efficiency. The story of the Soviet T-34 is a chronicle of industrial ingenuity, strategic necessity, and a radical departure from traditional tank design philosophy, a narrative where quantity and quality merge to overcome tactical brilliance, changing the course of armored warfare forever on the Eastern Front. The Nazis' initial laughter echoed a familiar theme amongst military officers faced with unexpected adversaries. The Wehrmacht's panzer divisions had dominated early war campaigns with their swift, coordinated Blitzkrieg tactics. The lightweight, fast Panzer III and IV seemed unbeatable, their tactics predicated on speed, agility, and precision strikes. In contrast, the T-34's design appeared backward. Thick, slanted armor, a powerful but bulky diesel engine, wide tracks designed to navigate the infamous Russian mud, Rasputitsa, and a 76.2 millimeters gun seen initially as outgunned by German cannons. Yet this pig was anything but backward in the hands of Soviet crewmen fighting for their homeland with desperate determination. Behind the T-34's formidable frame lay a brilliant synthesis of several critical innovations. Sloped armor, a revolutionary design at the time, vastly increased the effective thickness against incoming rounds. The wide tracks distributed the tank's weight, allowing it to traverse terrain impossible to lighter German tanks. The diesel engine offered reliability under harsh Soviet conditions, cold winters, and muddy spring thaws that stalled and stranded many German vehicles. What surprised the Germans more was the T-34's resilience under fire. The tank could absorb hits that would immobilize or destroy panzer opponents, continuing to press its advantage. Early tank battles at places like the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank engagement in history, revealed the brutal truth. The T-34 was no joke. It was a formidable weapon of war that negated many of the Germans' technological and tactical advantages. Soviet tank crews quickly adapted their doctrine to exploit this machine's strengths. Rather than engage in the tight, quick maneuvers favored by the Wehrmacht, Soviet tank formations operated in massed waves, using the T-34's durability and firepower to overwhelm German positions. The tank's 76.2 millimeters gun, initially adequate, was progressively upgunned in later variants, maintaining parity against German armor. Field commanders learned the brutal art of attrition warfare, leveraging T-34 seconds in combined arms operations supported by infantry and artillery. The psychological impact of encountering these monsters was palpable among German troops who had once dismissed them. Officers who had once sneered were forced to rethink their tactics in desperation. Initially, the Germans underestimated the Soviet industrial capacity that fueled the mass production of the T-34. While German tanks were excellent machines, they were complex and plagued by limited production capabilities. Meanwhile, Soviet factories across the Ural Mountains and beyond churned out T-34 seconds in staggering numbers, employing new assembly line techniques and a workforce mobilized to sustain the war effort. By mid-1943, the Wehrmacht's panzer divisions found themselves confronting a force they could not easily defeat. The once derided T-34 seconds now formed the backbone of Soviet armored strength, their presence on the battlefield a dark omen for German advances. Accounts from German tank crews and reconnaissance pilots recorded growing fear and frustration. The Russian pig had become a beast that refused to die. In tank duels, the T-34 combined firepower, protection, and mobility in ways Germany's current tanks could not match. The Panzer III and IV found themselves outclassed, forced to rely on heavier Tiger and Panther tanks that arrived too late to change the fate of many battles. In the summer of 1943, The T-34 saw its most famous baptism of fire at the Battle of Kursk, a clash that would decisively turn the tide of the war in the east. As German forces launched Operation Citadel, aiming to encircle and destroy the Soviet armored formations, they were met with a sea of T-34 seconds dug in with infantry, artillery, and anti-tank defenses. The battle was a brutal test of endurance, tactics, and industrial might. German tanks, despite their technological sophistication, were bogged down and overwhelmed by the sheer numbers and resilience of the Soviet armored corps. The T-34 seconds absorbed blows that would have shattered lesser machines, continuing to push forward in relentless waves, breaking German lines and forcing a costly retreat. The failure of the Germans at Kursk marked not only a military defeat but shattered their myth of armored invincibility. The tank they had mocked became the very instrument of their undoing. The transformation of the T-34 from an underestimated machine to a decisive force was not just technical but tactical and psychological. Soviet crews, driven by patriotism and determined leadership, learned to maximize the tank's capabilities. German commanders, often caught off guard, had to adjust their strategies, increasing reliance on heavier tanks and new anti-tank weapons, but the damage was done. The story of the T-34 encapsulates the larger dynamic of the Eastern Front. A titanic clash, not just of armies but of industrial systems, manpower and willpower. Where German strategic brilliance faltered under the weight of attrition and logistical strain, Soviet mass production and adaptability forged a weapon that ultimately crushed the Panzer divisions. By 1944, the T-34 had evolved further, its 85mm gun variants ready to take on even the Tiger tanks that had terrified earlier Soviet forces. These tanks spearheaded Soviet offensives that pushed German forces back through Eastern Europe towards Berlin. Today, the T-34 is remembered as one of the most influential tanks in history, a symbol of industrial might and resilience that defied expectations and changed armored warfare forever. Its story, from the initial Nazi mockery to its crushing dominance on the battlefield, is a testament to how innovation, production, and determination can overturn even the most confident military powers. The spring rains of 1943 melted into the brutal certainty of summer fronts along the Kursk salient. The air carried the rasp of radio chatter, the thud of artillery, and the low, persistent rumble of tracked armor as Soviet mechanics, gunners, and commanders prepared their lines. The T-34, once dismissed by many German observers as an overhyped crop of boilerplate and mud, stood in the center of this crucible, the embodiment of a doctrine that valued resilience as much as raw firepower. Across the ribbons of broken ground, German commanders watched the battlefield with a mix of professional respect and creeping unease. They had faced the T-34 skirmishes, in breaks of winter sunlight where its green hulls crept across fields like disciplined shadows. Each encounter had revealed a stubborn truth. These tanks did not break easily, did not die quickly, and did not retreat when the line was in sight. The Nazis had learned to adapt, to deploy anti-tank guns with more urgency, to recalibrate air support and infantry coordination, to blunt the massed, inexorable push of the Soviet armor. Yet even as they adjusted, the T-34's design continued to reveal its stubborn advantages. At the heart of the T-34's reputation lay a triad of innovations that altered how armored warfare could unfold. First was armor design, not merely thickness but its geometry. The sloped, well-sloped armor of the T-34, combined with a hull form and turret geometry tuned for ballistic deflection, reduced penetration by German rounds at many common engagement angles. Second was mobility. A rugged diesel engine, simple in its maintenance needs, powered through mud and frost, with fewer daily maintenance rituals than many contemporary German designs required. The wide tracks distributed weight and preserved cross-country speed, letting the T-34 exploit micro-topography, the shallow gullies and embanked furrows of the steppe more effectively than the majority of German tanks could manage. Third was firepower that could be adapted over time. The early 76.2mm gun proved formidable at typical combat ranges, and as the war progressed, variants could be upgunned, balancing the tank's durable chassis with higher velocity ammunition. The German response to these strengths was not solitary field improvisation, but a recalibration of entire armored warfare concepts. Tiger and Panther formations began to appear with greater frequency in encounters that previously would have favored more agile models. But even these heavier tanks faced the fundamental constraint that the T-34's durability and the Soviet logistics system could sustain attrition with a higher tolerance than their German counterparts. The frontline reports spoke of long stretches of nothingness, punctuated by sudden decisive bursts of red and steel. The T-34 did not merely clash with German armor. It disrupted German timetables, forcing a rethinking of commander-level decision-making and the tempo of offensive operations. In the skies above, pilots and observers noted a similar transformation. Luftwaffe reconnaissance units reported that the T-34 seconds, especially in groups, maintained cohesion under fire and kept advancing where lighter, more nimble enemy platforms might have twisted away or scattered. The visual cues, sunlight glinting off angled hull plates, the distinctive silhouette of a long-lived diesel exhaust became familiar to German air crews who learned to expect a stubborn return fire from these rugged machines. The psychological impact was tangible. A tank that refused to die or retreat, a vehicle that could absorb punishment and keep moving forward, changes the emotional calculus of any attacker. The Kursk bite into the German offensive was not merely a battlefield stalemate. It became a litmus test for the broader strategic improvisation the Soviet Union had achieved through industrial mobilization. Production lines across the Urals and the central factories of the republics shifted toward producing increasingly capable iterations of the T-34, culminating in upgrades such as improved turrets, more capable anti-tank gun integration, and armor that could better withstand the onslaught of German anti-tank weapons. The cumulative effect was a tank that could be fielded in large numbers, offering redundancy and resilience at scale, a force multiplier that the German high command could not simply outbuild through tactical bravado alone. To the soldiers inside the tanks, the narrative of dominance and mockery met a more grounded reality. The crews spoke in quiet, almost ritual terms about the challenges of combat. The noise of the diesel engine, the rumble of tracks, the meticulous choreographies of loading and aiming in the pressure-cooked confines of a cramped turret. They spoke of comrades who paid the ultimate price, but who stood as living symbols of what it meant to fight in a war where machines and endurance were the decisive elements. The T-34's crews, farmers, factory workers, engineers had learned to turn a rugged, utilitarian design into a practical instrument of battlefield strategy, performing maintenance in the field under harsh weather and with scarce resources. This practical know-how translated into a reliability standard that German crews could not simply replicate in the midst of war's chaos. The larger strategic arc was becoming visible. The German war machine, once celebrated for tactical brilliance and mechanized prowess, began to fracture under the weight of sustained industrialized resistance. Supply lines faltered as partisan networks, weather, and the vast expanse of the Eastern Front conspired against the logistics that propelled armored spearheads forward. In contrast, the Soviet system, though not without its own vulnerabilities, leveraged mass production and reorganization to replenish losses and keep the armored core in action. The sight of the T, 34 inches large numbers tightly formed, with the kind of discipline that comes from strong leadership and consistent doctrine, carved a new image into the German psyche. Invulnerability is not guaranteed by design, perfection alone, and the battlefield is a place where volume and resilience can overturn even the most advanced engineering. The mid to late 1943 period saw the T-34 continuing to adapt and to scale its influence. In combat, it encountered enemy anti-tank weapons that had been optimized for German armor and doctrine. The T-34's designers and operators responded by tweaking ammunition types, refining turret layouts, and training crews to exploit observational advantages and favorable terrain. These adjustments did not reverse the fundamental architecture of the T-34, the combination of a robust hull, sloped armor, and a locomotive's reliability, but they maximize its effectiveness in the face of increasingly capable adversaries. By the time the winter of 1943 to 1944 set in, the landscape of armored warfare had shifted from one of surprise to one of sustained contest. German forces, while still formidable in certain sectors, confronted an adversary capable of absorbing more punishment, learning quickly from each clash and returning to the field with incremental improvements that kept parity with the latest German tank variants. The myth of the unbeatable German Panzer Corps began to crumble in the face of a Soviet armored force that could outlast, outfavor, and outnumber the enemy in the right conditions. The moral of this chapter, a tank mocked into dominance, reflected a broader war lesson. In large-scale conflict, the asymmetries of production, logistics, and mass formation can outweigh even the most elegant single-vehicle solutions. The T-34 did not win the war by sheer speed or a singular breakthrough. It won by accumulation, numbers, reliability, and the ability to sustain a campaign under arduous conditions. It was not merely a weapon of war, but a symbol of industrial resolve channeled into artillery-hardened metal. As 1,944 turned into 1,945, the T-34 continued to accompany Soviet offensives that pressed toward Berlin. The later variants, with upgraded guns and improved armor, could match and sometimes surpass the late-war German heavy tanks in direct engagements. The tank's movement into Central and Eastern Europe carried with it the weight of a war that had been transformed by the Eastern Front's attritional struggle, where the equation of victory shifted toward industrial capacity and strategic perseverance as much as battlefield prowess. Today, the T-34's legacy stands as a testament to a military design philosophy that embraced robust simplicity, mass production, and practical adaptability. It is remembered not only for its battlefield victories, but for the way it reshaped the strategic balance of armored warfare in World War II. The tank that the Nazis mocked, by the time it finished its work on the German lines, had rewritten the rules of engagement, proving that a well-designed, well-supported machine can alter the course of a war when paired with organized industrial effort and resilient leadership on the ground. By the close of 1943, the T-34 had firmly established itself as the backbone of Soviet armored forces, but its story was far from static. What began as an innovative response to the constraints of early war Soviet tank production evolved into an ongoing saga of improvement and adaptation. The engineers and workers behind the scenes, deeply aware of the tank's critical role, pressed on with upgrades and refinements that would extend its battlefield dominance well into the final years of the war. One of the pivotal developments came with the introduction of the T-34 divided by 85 variant introduced in 1944. This iteration answered a pressing need to counter the appearance of heavier and more heavily armed German tanks, such as the Panther and the Tiger. The original 76.2 mm gun, effective against early German tanks, was increasingly strained by improved enemy armor. The new 85 mm gun mounted on the T-34 divided by 85 offered greater armor penetration and firing range, restoring the tank's offensive edge and balancing firepower with its renowned mobility and survivability. The larger turret of the T-34 divided by 85 also provided much-needed space for a three-man crew, including a dedicated commander, loader, and gunner, improving tactical efficiency. Earlier models housed two crew members in cramped conditions, forcing commanders to multitask as gun operators and radio operators, which hampered situational awareness, a crucial handicap in tank warfare. The upgraded turret elevated the T-34's combat effectiveness, allowing more complex and coordinated operations on the chaotic Eastern Front. Meanwhile, Soviet tank factory workers operated at a frenetic pace, their tireless output a showcase of industrial resilience under wartime pressure. Entire factories have been relocated eastward in the face of the German onslaught, beyond the Urals, safe from frontline bombing raids. This relocation did not slow production. On the contrary, it facilitated a concentration of skilled labor and resources that drove mass manufacturing efficiencies. Thousands of T-34 seconds rolled off assembly lines, each a steel testament to the Soviet Union's commitment to relentless attrition warfare. In the field, the T-34 divided by 85's arrival marked a turning point in the armored battles of 1944 and 1945. As Soviet forces pushed westward through Ukraine, Poland, and ultimately toward Germany itself, the tank proved itself once again. The balance of power in armored engagements shifted. German commanders, who had gained confidence in their heavier tanks, found their advantage neutralized by the newer Soviet tanks' capacity to engage and destroy at longer ranges, combined with their famed ruggedness and maneuverability under difficult terrain. Encounters involving the T-34 divided by 85 were fierce and often brutal. The tank's crews faced hardened German defensive lines, minefields, and well-coordinated anti-tank teams. Yet their determination and the tank's upgrades allowed the Red Army to sustain momentum across vast territories. The T-34's progress through towns and countryside became a symbol of Soviet resistance and resurgence, a moving bastion that carried with it the fate of millions. For the German troops facing these tanks, the T-34 divided by 85 was an object of grudging respect and increased caution. Intelligence reports circulated about the improvements, forcing tactical recalibrations and renewed investments in tank recovery and reinforcement strategies. The Wehrmacht attempted desperate countermeasures, deploying specialized tank destroyers and re-engineering defensive networks. But the sheer quantity of T-34 seconds rolling forward made complete containment impossible. Yet, the T-34's legacy was not solely defined by numbers and hardware. There was a deeper cultural resonance, a symbiotic relationship between the Soviet people and their Tank 1, where the vehicle represented not just war machines, but the sum of a nation's resilience and will to survive. Tales abounded of crews who personified the tank's indomitable spirit, sometimes fighting to the last shell, retreating only to repair and return to the fray. One of the most famous stories emerged from the fierce urban combat during the Battle of Berlin in 1945. Soviet T-34 crews navigated the shattered streets of the German capital, braving sniper fire and artillery as much as enemy tanks and infantry. The tank's relatively compact size and mobility allowed it to maneuver through narrow city streets and debris-strewn avenues more effectively than larger German heavy tanks. In many ways, the T-34 became a vehicle not only of crushing armored lines, but of closing the death throes of the Nazi regime in the heart of its capital. This adaptation to urban combat, coupled with the harsh lessons of years of open-field tank warfare on the steppe, demonstrated how flexible the T-34 platform was under varied conditions. It was no longer the Russian pig sneered at by early German observers. It was the iron hammer of a resurgent force, wielded with deadly efficiency by soldiers who knew that every engagement might be their last, but also marked a step toward victory. At the strategic level, the T-34's impact resounded in the very way Soviet command structured its campaigns. Tank armies, combined with motorized infantry and air support, operated as mobile shock forces, capable of breaking through enemy lines, exploiting breaches, and encircling enemy forces. The lessons from early defeats had been embedded in Soviet doctrine. The T-34 was more than a tool. It was the embodiment of a new martial synthesis that combined production scale, tactical innovation, and sheer endurance. The post-war years would only amplify the T-34's influence, inspiring tank designs across the globe. The United States, Britain, and other nations studied its combination of features, seeking to replicate or leverage similar principles of armor slope, diesel power plants, and balanced firepower. The tank's design philosophy proved prescient, anticipating many developments in armored warfare that would dominate Cold War battlefields. Yet perhaps the most striking legacy of the T-34 was how it symbolized a broader truth about war itself. Dominance is not guaranteed by initial power, by elegant design, or superior technology alone. It is won by those who can sustain, adapt, and produce in the face of adversity. The tank, dismissed with disdain by Nazi commanders, became the fulcrum of their defeat on the Eastern Front, a tangible testament to the brutal arithmetic of war. The final months of the war witnessed the T-34 transforming from a symbol of Soviet industrial resilience into a legendary icon of armored warfare, undeniably playing a pivotal role in crushing Nazi defenses and reshaping the pre-Saturate battlefield. As the Red Army pushed into occupied Europe with relentless force, the T-34's reputation grew beyond mere hardware. It embodied the strategic synthesis of mass production, ruggedness, adaptability, and unyielding willpower. The months of 1944 and 1945 proved the limits of German engineering and tactics. Despite deploying more sophisticated tanks like the Panther and Tiger, the Wehrmacht found itself increasingly outnumbered and outpaced by the Soviets' relentless slurry of armored might. The T-3485 model, with its upgraded 85mm gun and reinforced armor, became the backbone of Soviet breakthroughs. In the dense, muddy forests of Belarus, the scorched streets of Warsaw, and across the plains of East Prussia, the T-34 relentlessly pressed forward, smashing through German defenses, often in decisive spearheads designed to break the backbone of the Wehrmacht's resistance. Historians who analyze the course of World War II agree that while the German tanks remained technically superior in armor and firepower, the Soviet strategic use of mass logistics and industrial capacity shifted the battlefield balance decisively. The T-34 was no longer just a tank, but a symbol of Soviet resilience, an iron fist that crushed the final German defensive lines to open the gates of Berlin. In the final brutal campaign, the Battle of Berlin, the T-34 seconds played a decisive role in urban combat. Their compact size, combined with their unbeatable durability and firepower, allowed Soviet crews to navigate narrow streets and debris-choked avenues. They operated in tandem with infantry, artillery, and air support, encircling and obliterating Nazi resistance with relentless precision. No German heavy tank or anti-tank weapon could stand against them in this environment, and their presence left a trail of destruction behind every advancing column. In many ways, the T-34's influence extended beyond the battlefield. It became a potent symbol of Soviet industrial ingenuity. The factories that had been converted from peacetime production to wartime output churned out thousands of these tanks, each a masterpiece of engineering, overbuilt, overpowered, and ready for the relentless grind of combat. The defense industry's ingenuity shone brightest in the T-34's design, sloped armor, simple but effective layout, and mass-producible components. This approach revolutionized armored warfare that was, for the first time, defined by quantity, resilience, and practicality. This mass production advantage proved decisive. The Germans, despite their technological edge in some regards, simply could not keep pace with the Soviets' immense manufacturing machine. Where they fought with dwindling resources, fuel shortages, damaged factories, and a loss of experienced crews, the Soviets kept pressing home their advantage. The numbers told the story. Over 80,000 tons, 34 seconds built, more than any other tank in history, filling the battlefield with steel and firepower. For the German soldiers facing these steel giants, the psychological impact was profound. Tales from the front recalled soldiers' shock at the T-34's resilience, its ability to absorb multiple hits and keep fighting. Encounters of close-range combat often left German tanks shattered and crews dead or captured. The T-34's sloped armor and rugged simplicity meant that it often returned from engagements that would have reduced earlier tanks to scrap metal. The phrase "the Russian pig," once a mocking nickname, faded into awareness of an unstoppable force. The lessons learned throughout the war cemented the T-34's influence in military history. Its design principles, sloped armor, rugged diesel engines, ease of mass production would serve as a blueprint for future tank development worldwide. The Cold War era saw subsequent Soviet tanks, such as the T-54 and T-55, evolving from the core concepts embedded in the T-34. Despite the emergence of more advanced designs after World War II, the legend of the T-34 persisted as a symbol of Soviet resilience and industrial strength. Postwar, the T-34's influence was equally evident in global armored doctrine. Many nations adopted similar principles: mass production, simplicity, durability, becoming staple features of their own armored forces. Its legacy lies in proving that in a war of attrition, quantity combined with reliable design and strategic use can overcome even the most advanced and expensive enemy hardware. Today, the T-34 stands as more than a relic. It is a testament to the power of industrial policy, simple engineering, and enduring human spirit. Its story, from contemptuous mockery to battlefield dominance, encapsulates a fundamental truth of warfare: that resilience, mass, and adaptability often decide the outcome of conflicts more than technological supremacy alone. It transformed the very notion of what a tank could be, and proved that even the most underestimated machines can crush the strongest lines when backed by the collective will and industrial might of a nation. The T-34's crucible of combat, its relentless march through Europe, forever changed the way tanks were perceived and deployed. It was a machine that won battles, turned the tide of war, and ultimately won the war itself for the Soviet Union. And in the process, it rendered outmoded the might-mocking theories of its enemies, rewriting the history of armored warfare one mighty steel giant at a time.